The chain had frosted over her wrist. By the time he found her, her lips had turned the color of crows, but her eyes still hated the world. Darrow Strake saw the eyes first, a flicker of black against the absolute white of the morning. He'd been checking his western line, the traps laid for marten and fox, when the stillness of the air felt wrong. It wasn't the quiet of snow, which was a sound in itself, a muffling of the world's breath. This was a held breath, a silence with a tooth in it. He moved without sound, his one good eye scanning the drifts, the laden pines. The other, a puckered knot of scar tissue, saw only the memory of glare and blood. 23 winters in the Bitterroots had taught him to trust the feeling in his bones over the sight in his eye. Something was wounded. Something was waiting. And then he saw her. A small shape huddled at the base of a ponderosa, almost lost in the blue shadows. It was the unnatural darkness of her coat that drew him, a thing of trade cloth, not of hide. He approached slow, his rifle held easy across his chest. The cold was a blade. It scraped the lungs with every breath. He could feel it seeping through the thick wool of his coat, the layers of buckskin. For a child to be out in this, it wasn't a mistake. It was a sentence. She didn't move as he got closer. He thought she might be dead, another frozen tragedy the mountains would swallow and spit out in the spring thaw. But then her head lifted, her eyes black and flat as river stones fixed on him. There was no fear in them, no plea, only a loathing so pure it was a heat he could feel from 10 paces off. He stopped. The snow around her was undisturbed save for a single gouged track leading from the tree. He saw the chain then, a length of trapper's chain, the kind used for wolf or bear, looped around the trunk of the pine and locked to a manacle on her wrist. The steel was white with frost, a seamless extension of the cold itself, binding her to the wood. Her skin, where it met the iron, was raw and purple. She couldn't have been more than 10 winters old. Her face was smudged with dirt and frozen tears, her black hair matted with ice. A child of one of the Salish bands, or maybe the Kootenai. He didn't know the specific markings, the cut of the coat. He only knew she was a long way from any fire. He said nothing. Words were useless currency here. He unslung the small pack from his back, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He did not look at her eyes again. That was a place you could get lost in, a place that could strip the warmth from you faster than the wind. He worked. That's what he knew. From his pack, he took a small file and a vial of bear grease. He knelt in the snow before her, the cold biting through the knees of his trousers. She flinched, a bare tremor, but did not pull away. Her gaze was fixed on the side of his face, the ruined eye. He was used to it. People always looked at the damage first. He showed her the file. Then he showed her the lock on the manacle. He made no gesture of comfort, offered no soft words. He was a tool, and this was a job. He began to work on the lock, the rasp of metal on metal, a profanity in the white silence. His fingers, thick and calloused, grew numb quickly. He'd pull away, tuck them into his armpit to warm them, then go back to work. The girl watched. Her breathing was a shallow rasp, a small engine about to fail. The lock was old, rusted. The cold had seized it tight. It took a long time. The sun crested the eastern peaks, turning the snow from blue to a blinding, painful white. He squinted his good eye, the world flattening into light and shadow. The rhythmic scrape of the file was the only thing that felt real. Scrape. Scrape. The sound of patience. The sound of freedom being bought, not given. He felt her start to shiver, a deep, convulsive shudder that shook her small frame. It was the last stage. Before the body gave up, and a false warmth bloomed in the chest, a final lie before the end. He worked faster, his breath pluming in front of him. The metal was brittle. He had to be careful not to break his file. Finally, with a groan of tortured metal, the lock gave. He worked the pin free with the tip of his knife and pulled the shackle open. It was frozen to her skin. He didn't pull. He took the vial of bear grease and worked the slick fat into the gap between the iron and her flesh, gently, patiently, until the metal slid free. Her arm fell limp at her side. The skin beneath the manacle was a raw, weeping circle. Carved into the flesh just above it, stark against the bruised skin, was a shape. It wasn't a fresh cut. It was an old scar, a brand, a series of interwoven lines, a braid of flesh. It was a marking he had never seen before, but the precision of it, the deliberate sacred geometry, spoke of something important. A child of prophecy, the old stories sometimes said. A child who belonged to the spirits. He ignored it. It was not his story. He stood and slung his pack. The girl remained on the ground, watching him. He had freed her. The transaction was complete. He could walk away now, back to his line, back to the hard, clean solitude of his life. He had done more than most would. But her eyes, they held him. They did not ask for help, but they accused him. They knew him. He saw in them the reflection of 100 other pairs of eyes, the eyes of the dead on a field of trampled grass under a Montana sky. The eyes of the Comanche scout he had hidden beneath, feeling the man's last breath warm his cheek. He turned his back on her and started to walk away. The crunch of his snowshoes was loud. Each step was a choice. Leave her. She is not yours. The world put her here. Let the world take her. He made it 10 paces. 15. The silence behind him was as heavy as the chain had been. He stopped. He did not curse. He did not sigh. He simply turned around. She hadn't moved. She was a small, dark wound in the snow. Her eyes were still on him. He walked back, the snow crunching in defeat. He stood over her, a grim shadow against the snow. "Get up," he said. His voice was a rust-eaten thing, unused. She did not move. Only her eyes burned. He reached down and pulled her to her feet. She was light, a bundle of sticks. She swayed, her legs unsteady. He held her upright by the arm, his grip firm. He pulled the blanket from his pack and wrapped it around her shoulders. She suffered the touch without response. He looked back the way he had come. His cabin was a half-day's walk. It was a place of quiet, of order, a place where the ghosts stayed outside. Bringing her there was a violation. It was letting the wounded world in through the door. He tugged her arm gently. "Walk." She took a shuffling step, then another. Her body was stiff with cold, her will a sliver of flint. They moved slowly, 2 small figures against the vast, indifferent white. He did not look at her. He looked at the mountains, the jagged peaks that had been his only companions for 2 decades. They had buried his cowardice once. He wondered if they would do it again. She did not speak. She did not thank. She only walked beside him, a ghost he had chained himself to, her hatred a small, cold fire keeping them both alive. The cabin was 1 room, built of lodgepole pine he'd felled and stripped himself. The chinking was a mix of mud and moss, renewed every autumn. A stone fireplace dominated the north wall, its hearth black with years of soot. The air inside was cold, but it was a dry, still cold, free of the wind's bite. It smelled of pine smoke, curing hides, and solitude. He led her inside and guided her to the single stool by the hearth. She sat, rigid, the blanket still clutched around her. He moved with the economy of long habit, building a fire. He laid the kindling, the split pine, the larger logs of fir. A single spark from his flint and steel, a gentle breath, and a small flame wavered to life, a fragile orange flower in the gray gloom. He filled a pot with snow from the bucket by the door and hung it on the iron hook over the fire. He did not try to talk to her. He did not ask her name or where she came from. Questions were a trespass. He had brought her here to stop her from dying. That was all. While the snow melted, he checked her hands and feet. Her moccasins were worn through at the soles. He cut them away with his knife. Her feet were white and hard, the flesh like wax. Her fingers were the same. Frostbite, deep. She might lose a toe, maybe more. He looked at her face, but she was watching the fire, her expression unreadable. He took a basin and filled it with snow. He began to rub her feet, gently at first, then with more force, the friction bringing a painful, mottled color back to the skin. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath, the first sound he had heard her make. She tried to pull her foot away, but he held it firm. "This will hurt," he said, his voice flat. "Better than the alternative." She subsided, her body tense, her knuckles white where she gripped the stool. He worked in silence, rubbing her feet, then her hands, until the skin was flushed and angry-looking. The pain must have been immense, 1,000 needles of fire, but she made no other sound. Her stoicism was unnatural, a thing forged, not born. When he was done, he took a clean rag and coated it with a salve of willow bark and grease from his medicine pouch. He wrapped her feet and hands carefully, the movements of his thick fingers surprisingly deft. He had tended his own wounds for 20 years. He knew the cartography of pain. The water in the pot was steaming. He shaved a piece of dried venison into it, adding a pinch of salt and a handful of dried roots. The smell of broth began to fill the small room, a scent of life and warmth. He gave her a tin cup of the hot, clear liquid first. She held it in her bandaged hands, cradling the warmth. She did not drink. She just held it, staring into the flames. Darrow sat on his cot, watching her. The firelight flickered across her face, making shadows dance in the hollows of her cheeks. He saw the braid on her wrist again, the scarred, sacred mark. It was a question he could not ask. Who are you? Who would leave a child to die in the snow? Who would chain a child of prophecy to a tree? The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer his own. It was shared, a space between them filled with her pain and his past. He felt the old ghosts stir, the ones he kept at bay with work and exhaustion. The smell of the fire, the sight of the child, it was too close to another time, another life, a life with a wife, a son, a life before the raid, before the fire, before he had run and hidden and survived. Survival was its own kind of death sentence. She finally drank the broth, sipping it slowly, cautiously, as if expecting it to be poisoned. When the cup was empty, she held it out to him. He took it and refilled it with the thicker stew. She ate that too, using her fingers to pick out the pieces of meat. Her hunger was a raw, desperate thing. He ate his own portion standing by the fire, his back to her. He felt her eyes on his scar. He was a map of his own failures. The missing eye, the ropey burned scars on his forearms from pulling his wife's body from the flames of their homestead, the deeper scars that no one could see. When she was finished, she set the cup down on the hearth. Her eyelids were drooping. The warmth and the food were a powerful opiate. "You can sleep there," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the cot. It was his only bed, a frame of wood with a mattress of pine boughs and furs. She looked from the cot to him, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I will sit by the fire," he said. She considered this for a long moment. Then, slowly, she stood up and walked to the cot. She lay down on top of the furs, still wrapped in the blanket, and curled into a tight ball, her back to him. Within moments, her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Darrow sat on the stool she had vacated, adding another log to the fire. The storm had picked up outside, the wind howling around the eaves of the cabin, a lonely, predatory sound. He was trapped with her now, until the weather broke. He looked at the small form on his cot. A stranger, a burden, a judgment. He had lived his life by a simple code, interfere with nothing. The mountains had their own laws, their own cruelties. He was a guest here, a ghost among them. To interfere was to draw attention, to make a claim, and he had no claims to make. He had saved her from the chain, he had brought her out of the cold, but he could feel a new chain being forged, an invisible one, its links made of her silence and his guilt. He had tried to walk away, and he had failed. Now she was here, in his home, in his life, and he did not know what to do with her. He thought of the trail he'd have to make to take her back, wherever back was, south toward the Salish winter camps, north to the Kootenai. It would be a long, hard journey, a journey deeper into the wilderness that had been both his refuge and his prison. He looked at her sleeping form, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something other than the dull ache of memory. It was not hope, it was something colder, sharper. It was fear, not of the mountains or the cold or the wolves, but of the child, of the story carved into her wrist and the one he had buried in his own heart. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearth. Outside, the snow fell, burying the world deeper in white. For 3 days, the storm raged. The world outside the cabin was a white fury, a chaos of wind and snow. Inside, a different kind of storm brewed in the silence. The girl did not speak, not a word. She moved about the small space with a quiet, watchful grace. She ate what he gave her, drank the water he offered. She would sit for hours on the stool, her bandaged hands in her lap, and watch the fire. Or she would watch him. Her gaze was unnerving. It was not the curious gaze of a child, but the assessing stare of an elder. It peeled back the layers of him, the trapper, the hermit, and seemed to see the coward cowering beneath. Darrow kept to his routines. He mended his snowshoes, sharpened his knives, oiled his rifle. He spoke to her only when necessary, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be swallowed by the log walls. More wood. The water is hot. Eat. On the second day, he unwrapped her feet to check the frostbite. The flesh was angry and swollen, but the deep, dead whiteness was gone. He had saved them. He cleaned the weeping sores and applied a fresh poultice of chewed comfrey root, then rebandaged them. She bore the treatment with the same unnerving stillness, her eyes fixed on his face. He could feel the question in her stare. Why? Why are you doing this? It was a question he was asking himself. Every time he looked at her, he saw the ghosts of his own family. His son, who would have been about her age. He saw his wife's eyes, full of a trust he had betrayed. He had failed to protect them. He had survived. And survival was a debt that could never be repaid. He started talking to himself, a habit of long solitude he had never tried to break. He would mutter as he worked, commenting on the grain of the wood he was carving, or the way the storm sounded like a hungry animal. He never addressed her, but the words filled the space between them, a thin bridge over a chasm of silence. She, in turn, began to reveal herself in small, almost imperceptible ways. He left a small block of pine and a knife on the floor. The next morning, a roughly carved bird sat on the hearth. It was crude, but the shape was true. A whiskey jack. She had an eye for the world. Another time, he was plucking a grouse he'd snared near the cabin before the storm hit. He was clumsy, the feathers sticking to his greasy fingers. She got up, took the bird from him, and with her bandaged, clumsy hands, began to pluck it with a swift, efficient motion. She knew the work of a camp. She knew how to make a life in the wild. She was not some lost town girl. She belonged to these mountains, which made the chain, the tree, the sentence of death all the more inexplicable. On the third night, the storm broke. The wind died down, and a profound, ringing silence descended. The moon rose in a clear, star-pocked sky, and the world outside was transformed into a landscape of silver and blue. Darrow stood at the cabin's single window, a small square of scraped hide, looking out at the new-fallen snow. It was deep. Travel would be hard. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice loud in the sudden quiet. "We go." She was sitting on the stool, the firelight casting a warm glow on her face. She looked at him, her head tilted. "I will take you to the Flathead, the mission at St. Ignatius. The black robes will care for you." It was a lie. He had no intention of taking her to the priests. He knew what they did to children like her. They would scrub the wildness from her, give her a new name, a new god, and break her spirit. But it was a destination, a direction, a way to start. Her expression didn't change, but he saw something flicker in her eyes. A decision. She stood up and walked to the corner where he kept his spare furs. She picked up a small, soft rabbit skin and brought it to him. She held it out. A payment? A gift? He didn't know. He took it. The fur was soft against his calloused hand. Then she did something that startled him. She reached out with her bandaged hand and touched the puckered scar where his eye had been. Her touch was light, a bare whisper of contact. It was not a gesture of pity. It was one of curiosity, of acknowledgement. She was seeing him, the real him, the broken thing. He stood frozen, the rabbit fur in his hand. Her eyes held his, and for the first time, the hatred in them was gone. It was replaced by something else, something ancient and knowing. It was as if she was the elder, and he the child. She dropped her hand and went back to the stool. The moment was over, but something had shifted. The air in the cabin was different. The silence was no longer a weapon. It was a language. The next morning, he was ready before dawn. He had packed supplies for a week: dried meat, a small bag of flour, salt, his bedroll, an axe. He had fashioned a pair of crude snowshoes for the girl from Willow Branches and Hyde. He gave her a pair of his own thick wool socks to wear, and he had patched her moccasins as best he could. She stood by the door, watching him, a small, silent figure wrapped in his spare blanket. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and opened the door. The cold air hit them clean and sharp. The world was a pristine, glittering expanse of white. "It will be a hard walk," he said. She nodded, a single sharp dip of her chin. He led the way, his larger snowshoes packing a trail for her to follow. He headed south toward the river. The mission was south, but the winter camps of the Salish were also south. He would follow the river and look for signs, a track, a wisp of smoke, anything. They walked all day. The sun was bright on the snow, the glare relentless. Darrow pulled his hat low, his good eye aching. The girl followed behind him, her steps steady, tireless. She did not complain. She did not falter. She was as tough as the mountains themselves. As they walked, the landscape began to work on him. The vast, silent spaces, the towering peaks, they pried open the locked rooms of his memory. He saw the flash of a blue cavalry jacket against a summer sky. He heard the screams, the high, ululating cries of the Comanche warriors. He smelled the copper tang of blood, the acrid smoke of burning canvas. He remembered the weight of the scout, a man named Hears the Wind, as he fell on top of him. He remembered the gurgling sound in the man's throat, the way his blood had soaked through Darrow's shirt. He had lain there, under the dead man's body, for hours, not daring to breathe, listening to the sounds of the massacre, the sounds of his own world ending. He had survived because he was a coward. He had hidden while his friends, his neighbors, were slaughtered. He had bought his life with their deaths. He stumbled, catching himself on a tree. The memory was so vivid it was real. He could feel the phantom weight of the dead man on his back. He turned. The girl was standing a few feet behind him, watching him, her black eyes missing nothing. She knew. He felt it with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. She knew what he was. She could see the ghost he carried. He turned away from her, his face grim, and pushed on. He walked faster, trying to outrun the memories. But they were tireless. They kept pace with him, their silent footfalls matching his own. That night, they made a cold camp in a stand of thick pines. He built a small, smokeless fire in a pit, a trapper's fire that wouldn't be seen from a distance. They ate their dried meat in silence. The stars came out, cold and brilliant in the black sky. He lay in his bedroll, his rifle beside him. He could not sleep. He listened to the soft breathing of the girl, who had curled up on a bed of pine boughs on the other side of the fire. He had taken her from one kind of danger and led her into another. The mountains were not empty. There were wolf packs. There were grizzlies, even in winter, sometimes roused from their dens. And there were men. Men who were far more dangerous than any animal. Men like the ones who had chained her to a tree. He wondered about the braid on her wrist, a child of prophecy. What did it mean? Was she a blessing or a curse? Was she his salvation or his damnation? He closed his good eye, but the images were still there, burned onto the inside of his eyelids. The field of bodies, the dead scout, the girl's eyes full of a hatred that was slowly, terrifyingly, turning into understanding. He had spent 20 years running from his past, and now it was walking right behind him, leaving small, determined footprints in the snow. They traveled for 4 more days. Darrow pushed them hard, moving from dawn until dusk, speaking only to point out a landmark or give a direction. He was a man fleeing a fire, but the fire was inside him. The girl kept pace, her resilience a constant, silent rebuke. She was no longer just a burden, she was a witness. Her presence forced an accounting he had avoided for 2 decades. The landscape changed. They descended from the high, windswept ridges into the deeper valleys, following the frozen artery of a river. Here the trees were thicker, the shadows deeper. The silence was heavier, weighted with secrets. Darrow felt a growing unease. This was old country, a place of power. He saw pictographs on a rock face, faded red figures of men and beasts, their arms raised to a forgotten sky. He saw medicine bundles tied to the high branches of a cottonwood, their contents a mystery, their purpose a warning. They were not alone. On the 5th day, he found the tracks. 3 riders, shod horses, heading south. Recent. The tracks were sharp-edged in the snow, white men, trappers maybe, or prospectors. He studied the sign. They were moving slow, deliberately, hunting, but not for animals. He knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of a hoofprint. A cold dread settled in his gut. These were the men. He knew it. The men with the chain. He looked at the girl. She was staring at the tracks, her face a mask of stone. She knew it too. "We go a different way," he said, his voice low. He turned them west, away from the river, climbing back into the broken country, the labyrinth of rock and deadfall that the horses couldn't easily navigate. It would add days to their journey, but it was safer. She followed without question. But something had changed in her. The watchfulness was sharper, the silence more tense. She moved like a deer, her senses on a knife's edge, constantly scanning the trees, the ridges above them. That night, the dream came for him again. It was always the same. The sun is hot, the grass is high. He is hiding, his face pressed into the dirt, the smell of blood and crushed sage in his nostrils. The Comanche scout hears the wind, lies on top of him, a dead weight. Darrow can hear the screams of his wife, Sarah. He can hear the single gunshot that silences her. He does nothing. He lies there, paralyzed by a cowardice so profound it has its own gravity, pinning him to the earth. He survives. He woke with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs. The fire was down to embers. The girl was sitting up, watching him. In the faint, pulsing glow of the coals, her eyes were black pits. "Bad dream," he rasped, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. She said nothing. She simply reached into the small pouch she wore at her belt, a pouch he hadn't noticed before, and took out a small, smooth stone. It was dark, almost black, with a single white line running through it. She held it out to him. He hesitated, then took it. The stone was cool and heavy in his palm. It felt solid, real, a piece of the earth. He closed his fist around it, the pressure a small anchor in the swirling chaos of his mind. She lay back down and was asleep in moments. He sat there for a long time, the stone in his hand, the dream receding, leaving its bitter residue. The girl had given him a rock to hold on to, a piece of her world to quiet his. The intimacy of the gesture was a shock. It was a kindness he did not deserve. The next day, he saw the smoke. A thin, almost invisible plume against the gray sky, miles to the south. A camp. It had to be her people. He had a choice. He could take her there, leave her, and walk away. Disappear back into his solitude, the debt paid. Or he could turn back north, take her to the mission as he'd lied about, and wash his hands of this. The mission was safe, orderly. It would be an end. But he knew he couldn't. Taking her to the priests would be its own kind of betrayal. It would be like chaining her to a different kind of tree. He looked at her. She had seen the smoke too. Her eyes were fixed on it, a desperate, hungry look on her face. For the first time, he saw a child's longing there. The longing for home. "Is that them?" he asked. She nodded. Her first direct communication. The nod was a release, a confirmation. He took a deep breath. The air burned his lungs. "All right," he said. "Let's go." They moved toward the smoke, their pace quickening. The sense of being watched intensified. He knew they were being observed. The people of these mountains, they didn't miss a thing. A broken twig, a displaced stone, a stranger moving through their land. It was all noted, all read like a book. He felt like a man walking into a courtroom, his guilt his only companion. As they drew closer, the landscape itself seemed to be guiding them. The path opened up, the deadfall cleared. They entered a narrow canyon, the walls rising steeply on either side. The air grew still, the only sound the crunch of their snowshoes. At the end of the canyon was a small, sheltered valley. A dozen lodges, made of hide and canvas, were nestled among the pines. Smoke rose from their peaks, merging with the gray sky. Horses stood tethered, their breath misting in the cold air. It was a winter camp, quiet and self-contained. But there were no people, no children playing, no women working, no men talking. The place was silent as the morning he had found her. Darrow stopped at the edge of the trees, his hand on his rifle. This was wrong. The stillness was the stillness of a held breath, the same stillness. The girl walked past him, out into the open. She walked toward the largest lodge in the center of the camp. She did not hesitate. The flap of the central lodge opened. A man emerged. He was tall and lean, his face a mask of deep lines and old grief. He wore a simple buckskin shirt and leggings. His long gray hair was in 2 braids, wrapped in otter fur. He was not a chief, not a warrior. He was something else, a holy man, a keeper of stories. His eyes found the girl. They did not light up with joy or relief. They were full of a terrible sorrow. He looked from her to Darrow, and his gaze was heavy, ancient. It held no anger, only a profound, weary sadness. Other figures began to emerge from the lodges, men and women. They were all older. There were no young warriors. There were no other children. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their faces etched with the same sorrow as the old man. They formed a silent circle around the girl, their eyes on her, then on Darrow. No one spoke. The silence was a physical weight. Darrow felt it pressing down on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. He was an intruder, a profanity in this sacred grieving space. The girl walked to the old man and stood before him. She looked up at him, her face impassive. He reached out and gently touched the scarred braid on her wrist. A tremor went through his hand. Then he looked at Darrow. His eyes were not the eyes of an accuser. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst of the world and had found no answers. "You freed her," the old man said. His voice was soft, but it carried in the still air. It was not a question. "I did," Darrow said, his own voice sounding harsh and loud. "The men who did this," the old man said, his gaze sweeping over the silent people around them. "They came here. They were looking for gold. They said this land was theirs now. They said we had to leave." He paused, his eyes finding the girl again. "We would not. This is the land of our ancestors. This is the land where the spirits speak." He looked back at Darrow. "They took our young men, the ones who would have fought. They shot them. They took our food. They said they would let us starve. But they were afraid of her." He nodded toward the girl. "They saw the mark. They heard the stories. They did not want to spill her blood on this ground. They believe in some curses, you see. So they took her into the mountains. A gift for the cold spirit, they said. A way to break our heart." Darrow's blood ran cold. He understood now. The silence of the camp. The grief. This was not a tribe. This was a remnant. A handful of elders left to die. The men he had seen, the tracks he had followed, they had done this. They had committed a slow, casual massacre and left the evidence chained to a tree. The old man's eyes bored into him. "You brought her back. Why?" Darrow had no answer. Because her eyes hated the world? Because he knew what it was to be the sole survivor? Because he was a coward, and this was the one brave thing he could do? The reasons were a tangled knot in his gut. "She is the last," the old man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She is the last child of the Sky People. She carries the stories. She carries the future. A future we will not live to see." He looked around at the silent faces, the circle of ghosts. We are the end of the song. The girl, who had been silent for so long, finally acted. She turned from the old man and walked to Darrow. She stood before him, so close he could feel the faint warmth of her body. She looked up at him, and her eyes were clear. The hatred was gone. The assessment was gone. There was only a deep, profound, and terrible understanding. She reached out and took his hand, the one that held the smooth, dark stone she had given him. She curled his fingers around it, her small bandaged hands covering his. Then she looked at the old man, and she pointed. She pointed at Darrow. The old man's gaze followed her finger. He looked at Darrow, and for the first time, his expression changed. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Interest. Recognition. "She has chosen," the old man said. "She has chosen a new path." He looked Darrow up and down, his gaze lingering on the scarred eye, the worn buckskins, the rifle in his hand. "The spirits work in ways we do not understand. They send a broken man to save a broken people." Darrow felt a tremor of fear. What was happening? What was she choosing? "She cannot stay here," the old man said, his voice regaining its strength. "This is a place of death. The men will come back. They will not leave this valley until they have stripped its bones. She must go on. The song must go on." He stepped forward, his eyes locked with Darrow's. "You will take her. You will take her from this place. You will take her to the smoking mountains, to the land of the crow. They are our cousins. They will know the mark. They will protect her. You will be her guardian. You will be her shield." It was not a request. It was a command, a prophecy, a sentence. Darrow looked down at the girl. Her hand was still on his. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She was chaining him to her, not with iron, but with a trust he had not earned. He was a trapper, a hermit, a ghost. He was not a guardian. He was not a shield. He was the man who hid under a dead body while his world burned. "I can't," he said, the words torn from him. "I am not the man you think I am." The old man smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "No," he said, "you are not. You are the man she knows you are. He gestured to the mountains that ringed the valley. This land knows you. It has held your secrets for many winters. It has waited for you. He turned and walked back to his lodge. The other elders watched him, their faces impassive. The judgment was over. The verdict had been delivered. Darrow was left alone in the center of the circle of silent people, with the girl's hand in his. He was to take her deeper into the wilderness, deeper into the continent, to a strange people in a strange land. He was to be her protector, him, the coward of the Marias River. He looked down at her small, determined face. Her eyes were not the eyes of a child. They were the eyes of a destiny he had stumbled into. He had freed her from one chain, only to find himself bound by another, stronger one, a chain of purpose, a chain of honor. He looked at the silent lodges, at the grieving faces, at the vast, unforgiving mountains. He had come here to return her, and now he was being sent away with her into a future he could not imagine. He had tried to outrun his past, and it had led him here, to the one place where it could be redeemed. He squeezed her hand. The stone was still in his palm, a hard, cold piece of truth. "All right," he whispered, the word lost in the great, white silence. "All right." They left the Valley of Ghosts at dawn. The old man, whose name he never learned, gave them a pack with dried buffalo meat, pemmican, and a small bag of sacred tobacco. He gave Darrow a map, not of ink on hide, but of words, a litany of rivers, mountains, and stars to follow. Go south until you find the river that tastes of salt. Follow it to the setting sun. Cross the snow-topped mountains. The land of the crow, the Absaroka, is beyond. They will be waiting. He did not say how they would be waiting. As they walked away, Darrow looked back. The elders stood in a silent line, watching them go. They did not wave. They did not call out. They were statues of grief, watching their last hope, their last song, walk away in the care of a broken white man. The girl did not look back. Her face was set toward the south, toward the future. The journey was a descent into a deeper wild. They left the familiar territory of the Bitter Roots and entered a vast, unmapped country. The mountains were bigger here, the valleys deeper. The sky seemed wider, colder. For weeks, they saw no sign of human life. They were two small specks in an immense, empty landscape. The silence between them settled into a comfortable rhythm. They spoke little, but they communicated in a language of gestures, of shared glances, of mutual understanding. He taught her how to set a snare, how to read the tracks of a wolf, how to find north by the bark of a tree. She, in turn, showed him which roots were good to eat, which berries would not kill him, how to listen to the language of the birds. He was the teacher of hard survival. She was the teacher of deep living. He found himself watching her, not as a burden, but as a marvel. She had a resilience that humbled him. She never complained of the cold, the hunger, the endless walking. She met each day with a quiet, steady grace. The hatred he had first seen in her eyes had been a shield. Beneath it was a strength that was as old as the mountains themselves. The ghosts of his past still walked with him, but they were quieter now. The girl's presence was a buffer. When the dream of the massacre came, he would wake to find her sitting up, watching him, the small, dark stone ready in her hand. She did not offer comfort. She offered solidity, a reminder of the living world. One night, as they sat by the fire, he found himself speaking. The words came out unbidden, a torrent of memory he had held back for 20 years. He told her about the homestead, about his wife, Sarah, her laughter like the sound of the creek in spring, about his son, Thomas, a small boy with his mother's eyes. He told her about the raid, the fire, the smell of blood, and he told her about Here's the Wind, the Comanche scout who had been his friend. He told her how the man had fallen on him, an arrow in his back, and in that last, dying moment had whispered, "Stay down, live." He told her how he had obeyed, how he had listened to the world end, his face pressed into the dirt, hidden by the body of a brave man. He spoke for hours, his voice a raw, cracked thing. The girl listened, her gaze never leaving his face. She did not judge. She did not pity. She simply listened. She received his confession like the earth receives the rain. When he was finished, a great shuddering sob escaped him. It was a sound of immense pain, of a grief 20 years old. He wept, his body shaking, his face in his hands. He had never allowed himself to grieve. He had never believed he had the right. The girl did not touch him. She did not speak. She simply sat there, a silent witness, her presence a quiet anchor in his storm of grief. She let him be broken. She let him fall apart. And in the breaking, something new began to form. When the tears finally subsided, he felt empty. The guilt was still there, a hard knot in his gut. But it was different. It had been seen. It had been heard. It was no longer a secret he had to carry alone. He looked at her, his one eye red and swollen. "Thank you," he whispered. She nodded, a slow, solemn gesture. Then she lay down and went to sleep. The next morning, he felt lighter. The world seemed sharper, the colors more vivid. He had given her his story, his shame, and she had not turned away. They found the salt river the old man had spoken of and followed it west. The land began to change. The mountains softened into high, rolling plains. Great herds of buffalo moved across the landscape like a slow brown river. This was the beginning of the land of the Crow. Darrow felt a new anxiety. These were not his people. He was a stranger, an intruder. He was bringing them a sacred child. How would they receive him? A white man with a scarred face and a haunted past. They saw the riders from a distance. 3 of them, sitting on their horses on a high ridge, watching them. They were too far away to see clearly, but their stillness was unnerving. They were not a threat. They were an escort. Darrow and the girl continued to walk, their pace steady. The riders followed, keeping their distance, 3 dark silhouettes against the vast sky. They were being led. After 2 days of this silent escort, they came to a large encampment. Hundreds of lodges were spread across a wide river valley. Thousands of horses grazed on the plains. This was not a small band of survivors. This was a nation, powerful, proud. As they approached the camp, a group of men rode out to meet them. They were tall, imposing figures, their faces painted, their hair decorated with feathers. They carried rifles and lances. They were warriors. They circled Darrow and the girl, their horses kicking up dust. Their faces were hard, their eyes suspicious. Darrow stood his ground, his hand resting on his rifle, but not threateningly. The girl stood beside him, her face calm, her gaze steady. One of the warriors, a man with a face like a hawk and a long scar on his cheek, dismounted. He was clearly the leader. He strode toward them, his eyes narrowed. He looked at Darrow, his gaze contemptuous. Then he looked at the girl. His expression changed. He saw the braid on her wrist. His eyes widened in recognition, then in awe. He dropped to one knee, his head bowed. "She has come," he whispered, his voice full of reverence. "The daughter of the sky. The song has returned." The other warriors dismounted, their hard faces transformed by the same look of awe. They knelt in the dust before the small, silent girl. The girl looked at the kneeling warriors, then she looked at Darrow. She took his hand. The leader, the man with the scar, looked up. He saw the girl holding the white man's hand. He saw the trust in her eyes. His gaze shifted to Darrow, and the contempt was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. "You are her guardian," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "I am," Darrow said. The warrior stood. "I am Iron Shield. You will come with us. The Council of Elders awaits." They were led into the heart of the camp. The people came out of their lodges to see them, their faces a mixture of curiosity and wonder. They all stared at the girl, their whispers following her like a breeze. The daughter of the sky. The prophecy is fulfilled. They were taken to a large council lodge. Inside, a dozen old men sat in a circle around a central fire. They were the leaders of the Crow Nation, their faces maps of wisdom and power. Iron Shield led Darrow and the girl to the center of the circle. "She is here," Iron Shield announced. "The one foretold. She was brought by this man." The eldest of the council, a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that seemed to see into Darrow's soul, spoke. His name was Runs with the Wolf. "We have been waiting. The spirits told us you were coming. They told us of the Sky People. Your people," he said, looking at the girl. "They told us of their sorrow, and they told us of their last song." He then turned his ancient eyes on Darrow. "The spirits also told us of you, the one-eyed man, the man who hides from his own shadow." Darrow felt a chill go through him. They knew everything. "The girl has chosen you as her guardian," Runs with the Wolf continued. "This is a great honor, and a great burden. You have brought her to us. Your task is done. You are free to go. We will give you horses, supplies. You can return to your mountains." Darrow looked at the old man. He looked at the circle of powerful, waiting faces. He could leave. He could walk away. He had done what was asked of him. He had delivered the girl. He could go back to his cabin, to his solitude, to the quiet, empty life he had built. He looked down at the girl. She was still holding his hand. She looked up at him, and her eyes asked a single, silent question. He thought of the Valley of Ghosts, the old man watching them leave. He thought of his confession by the fire, the weight of his shame being lifted, not by forgiveness, but by being seen. He thought of the journey, the shared silence, the language they had built between them. To leave her now would be the final cowardice. It would be to abandon the one thing that had given his broken life meaning. It would be to walk away from his own soul. He took a deep breath. He met the gaze of Runs with the Wolf. "I am Darrow Strake," he said, his voice clear and steady. "And I have no place to go back to." He knelt down on one knee in the dirt of the council lodge. He was not kneeling to the elders or to the Crow Nation. He was kneeling to the girl, to her strength, to her forgiveness. "My name is Darrow Strake," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. "I once survived a massacre by hiding under the body of a Comanche scout. The place was called the Marias River. It is where I should have died. It is the place where I lost my honor." He looked up at the girl. "I have nothing left to offer. No name worth keeping, no honor worth claiming. All I have is the place where I should have died. I offer it to you. My life is yours. I will be your guardian. I will be your shield. I will not leave your side." A profound silence filled the lodge. The elders stared at him, their faces unreadable. Iron Shield watched, his hand on the hilt of his knife. The girl looked down at the kneeling man, the man who had freed her from the chain, the man who had carried her out of the snow, the man who had confessed his deepest shame to her. She reached out her free hand, the one that was not holding his, and she touched the puckered scar where his eye had been. The same gesture she had made in the cabin so long ago, a gesture of acknowledgement, of acceptance. Then she spoke. For the first time, she spoke. Her voice was not a child's voice. It was clear and low and full of an ancient authority. She said one word, his name, Darrow. It was not a question. It was not a command. It was a claiming. It was an answer. It was the end of one song and the beginning of another. The old elder, Runs with the Wolf, smiled. A deep, genuine smile that transformed his wrinkled face. "It is done," he said. "The guardian has found his name. The daughter of the sky has found her shield. Let the new song begin." Darrow Strake remained kneeling, his head bowed, the girl's hand in his. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls of the lodge. Outside, the sounds of the camp, of a living, breathing nation, went on. He was no longer a ghost. He was no longer a hermit. He was a man with a purpose, a broken man, remade. He had walked into the heart of his own fear, and on the other side, he had not found death. He had found a name, and a reason to live. The price had been everything he was. The reward was everything he could become. The snows of the Bitterroots were a lifetime away. Before him was a new landscape, a new life, a future he would face not with one eye, but with two hearts.